Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is a leading broadcast journalist. She's currently chief correspondent and substitute anchor for PBS NewsHour. Prior to that, she was an anchor and correspondent at ABC News and NBC News. She has received numerous awards, including an Emmy Award and a Society for Features Journalism Award. But what really endears her to us is that she's been a longtime TCF supporter. Back in 2009, when TCF was not as well known, she did a fantastic story on TCF's work on behalf of NBC News, which really helped put the organization on the map in the US. With your applause, please welcome Amna Nawaz.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I think some of you may know me as Amna Nawaz from the PBS NewsHour, but I think it's fair to say most of you know me as Amna Nawaz, daughter of Shuja and Seema Nawaz, and that's fair. It's my proudest title. Can you all just join me in giving a special thanks, please, to Shimi Kidvai, who I know as my dear Shimi Auntie, who is the force who brought us all together here tonight. Thank you so much, Shimi Auntie. Listen, I'm here tonight for the very first time in person at a TCF Gala, but as you just heard, I've long been a supporter. And I'm a supporter because I've had the chance to see firsthand, up close, what TCF can do. Earlier in my career, I had the privilege of working as a foreign correspondent for NBC News and as their bureau chief in Islamabad. And those years, grueling though they were, covering war in Afghanistan and conflict and upheaval in Pakistan, they were really a rare blessing for me to be able to report from the country that my family calls home. To get to know it better as an adult, separate from our time visiting as children growing up, and to get to know its strengths and its weaknesses and its fears and its hopes. It is easy in my job, as you probably know for journalists, it's easy in my job to focus on what's going wrong. Because let's be honest, there's a lot going wrong, and that's when we tend to show up, is when things have gone horribly wrong. But from time to time, I do get the chance to shine a light on one of the corners where really good work is being done, and a real difference is being made, and lives are being changed. And I had that chance when I first visited a TCF school in Karachi. It was December of 2009, and this TCF school was in a part of Karachi called Machar Colony. Now, for the non-Urdu speakers among us, Machar means mosquito. This was an overcrowded temporary settlement that was built on swamplands and named for its original inhabitants. And back then, it was just a crowded, tens of thousands of people in temporary shelters, crowded into very narrow, labyrinthian streets lined, by the way, with the waste and the runoff of Pakistan's most populous city. And I was warned when I went in not to turn the wrong way down this certain lane, not to go too far into this neighborhood. It wasn't safe. The drug trade was rampant, gang violence was rampant. This was no place for a child to grow up. And most children I met there worked. The fishing industry dominated there, shrimping in particular. Children, because of their small and tender hands, were often recruited to peel and devein the shrimp, and they would do so for hours every day. Thousands and thousands of shrimp, and paid mere rupees for every giant bucket that they filled. And you'd see these kids everywhere, running in the streets. Sometimes they didn't have shoes, sometimes no shirt or no pants, but they all had little buckets. Kids as young as 3 and 4 years old, trailing behind some of the older kids, everyone doing their part just to keep their family alive. Now, when I say that I grew up privileged, I don't mean that I had everything handed to me. My parents, like many of you and your parents, sacrificed when they needed to, and they spoiled us whenever they could. But what I always had, what my sisters and I always had, was the security and the stability of a stable, loving upbringing. And what that gives you as a child is the chance to be a child, and to just live, and to dream, and to hope, and not spend your days worrying about where your next meal is coming from, or if you're going to make it home safe at the end of the day. And these kids didn't have that. They didn't have that. And I couldn't help but look at their faces and see the faces of kids in my family, and hear the names of people that I loved. But a few hundred kids in that community did get that chance. Because at one end of the community stood a gated, walled compound. And when you walked through those gates into the TCF school property, it was like stepping into a different world. It was a world of safety and security and hope. And for a few hundred kids every day, that is what it gave them. Now, tuition back then was about 10 rupees a month, they told me. School was half a day, so their families didn't have to choose between losing the income of them working for part of the day and still going to school. No child was turned away because of their age, so some classrooms had kids as young as 4 or 5, learning right next to kids as old as 10 or 11 or 12 because that's the right place for them. That's where they were ready to learn. And these kids, I have to tell you, these kids were great. And they loved meeting this strange lady who looked kind of like them or someone in their family, but spoke Urdu with a funny accent, and then spoke English to the man carrying a camera with her. They were confused but intrigued. So I met a little boy named Temur. Temur was 10, at least he thought he was 10. He said no one really knew for sure. They didn't remember when he was born, and no one kind of kept track. So when I asked him why he said he was 10, he said, well, the other kids who are as tall as me say they're 10, so I think I'm 10. He was a lanky kid. He had light eyes. He had a chipped front tooth, this mop of reddish brown hair, just a lovely kid. And he'd been working as a tailor's apprentice for years before he started school. He spent hours every day hunched over machinery and over tables, and he developed back problems as a kid. And he had just started kindergarten at 10 years old, 2 months earlier when I met him. And he loved it. He loved putting on his uniform every day. He would cinch his belt really tight because his pants were very, very big and he was very, very skinny. He loved learning to read and write. He was the first one to raise his hand anytime the teacher asked for a volunteer to come up to the front. He sang Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star at the top of his lungs, like his life depended on it, standing next to a kid half his size. He was loving every second of it. And his eyes would just light up when he talked to me about life inside that school. And then they would dim when he would talk about what life was like outside. What that school gave him for a few hours every day was just the chance to learn and to dream about a different kind of life and to hope for a better future. I also met this lovely young girl named Sidra, who was in 3rd grade. She was very tall and very soft-spoken, but very elegant, very poised for someone her age. She had 2 very neat braids on either side of her head. She'd never been outside of Mutcher Colony. She was born and raised there. But when I asked her what she wanted to do, she said, I want to be a doctor. And when I asked her why, she listed person after person she had known in her family and in her community who had gotten sick or was sick or who had died because they didn't have basic medical care. Watching Sidra in class was like watching a storm gather speed. I mean, the intensity and the focus and the sheer unstoppable determination this little girl put into her education, you just knew she was going to go and do big things in the world one day. That as soon as she had the chance to break out, she would. Now, I have been blessed in my life, like many of us, I think it's fair to say, to go out into the world and try to do big things. And for those of you who know my work, I often focus on the stories of children wherever I go, in conflict or war zones or natural disasters or on migration trails, what children endured during this pandemic, or even children in poverty here at home. And I do that because in a world where we have a lot of trouble agreeing on some of the big important things, this is an easy one. This is one of the easiest things in the world to get behind. It is a core tenet of all of us as human beings, and it's a core tenet of my work, which is this: all kids are my kids. All kids are our kids. And if we can't take care of the weakest and the most vulnerable among us, then we are all failing, and I, for one, refuse to fail. Back when I visited the school in 2009, here are some statistics. Pakistan's Federal Education Ministry said literacy was around 50%. It dipped much lower for women in some parts of the country. More than a third of all students who actually enrolled in school dropped out before the 6th grade, and those numbers were an improvement from a decade earlier. I think today literacy is higher, but we all know what the last couple of pandemic years have done. The poorest and the most vulnerable have fallen behind. The gaps have gotten bigger, and as you saw, The recent floods have only widened those gaps. Our kids are falling behind. This summer, I had the chance to travel with and interview U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy. It is his second time serving in that role, first under President Obama, now under President Biden. He is a Harvard grad, a Harvard med grad, a Yale grad. He's a doctor. He's the child you all want. I get it. You can say that. But he shared with me the story of how he got there, which I think is important to share here. He's a doctor, so is his sister, so is his father. But his grandfather, his father's father, was a farmer in a poor village in southern India. And he lost his wife early, and he raised his kids alone. And he was known in the village for being the one, even though he could barely feed his own kids some days, who went around raising money to build school structures so that every kid could get an education. And when other people would scold him for that and say, "Why are you spending all your time doing this when you can't even put food on your own table?" And he would say, "All these kids are my kids. And if we're not taking care of all of them, then we're not taking care of any of them." In 2013, I had the chance to embed with Pakistan's military and travel through South Waziristan and eventually drop into North Waziristan for a look at that army's battle against then the Afghan Taliban and elements of al-Qaeda that had made a base there. And at the time, only my husband, Paul, and I knew that I was actually a few months pregnant with our first child. And I was very, very sick, and I was very, very tired, and I did a very, very bad job at hiding it on the helicopter rides and the mountaintop treks. But I had the chance to meet families on the ground, mostly men, of course, out in public. And I would ask them again and again, "What is it you need? What do you want here?" And I heard the same things. We need a road, we need a hospital, we need a school. We have to be able to safely travel, to buy things and sell things. We need to make sure women aren't dying in childbirth. And we want to educate our kids. A road, a hospital, a school. And that was the moment for me, when I could see clearly the future that these kids in front of me had before them, and I knew the future that my child inside of me had before her. That enormous gap that had nothing to do with anything other than a twist of fate that gifted one and robbed another of that chance to live securely and to dream and to hope. All kids are our kids. Look, this is a hope I was very lucky to see in action every day, being raised by my wonderful parents, my father, Amna Nawaz, who's here tonight. My mother, Seema, could not be here. She's recovering from knee surgery. It's a hope I see every day in my sisters. One of my sisters, Zainab, is here tonight. The other is in New York, in the way that they live their lives with grace and with strength. It's a hope I see in journalism every day and with a number of my colleagues who are here tonight, and I'll shout them out, including Zeba and Teresa, Ali, Tess, Seher, her husband, Junaid. And it's a hope I see every day in my friends and special guests, Madeline and Michael, in the service that they put to their nation every day. I know it's a hope. I know it's a hope all of you in this room share as well, otherwise you wouldn't be here. And I'll tell you personally, it's a hope my husband Paul and I share in the way that we raise our two girls and teaching them that good is not a thing that you are, good is a thing that you do. Hope is a discipline. It is hard to hang on to, especially in these times, but it is the one thing, regardless of what you come into with this world and regardless of what you leave behind, it's the one thing that we can gift to our kids, to all of our kids. So I am so very grateful to have the chance to help spread some of that hope with you. I'm so grateful to the work that TCF does to seed that hope into the next generation, and I'm grateful for the chance to be with you here tonight. Thank you so much.